Welcome back to Coursera course Know Thyself. I'm Mitch Green, and today we're going to be talking about Plato, Socrates, and the way in which Socrates was on trial. Socrates was a philosopher in ancient Greece in a famous city-state known as Athens. Athens is, of course, a city thriving today. And Socrates' dates were 469 to 399 BC, so he lived quite a long time ago. And he was kind of a strange bird in that he didn't seem to have any kind of settled profession. He didn't seem to be willing to write anything. He was not interested in making money. He just seemed to spend most of his time hanging out with especially young men who were interested in what he had to say and wanted to learn from him. But what was unusual about Socrates is that he didn't seem to try to teach anything either. He professed that he didn't know much of anything. So he was the son of a midwife and a sculptor, and he was reported to be kind of funny looking, and with a strangely shaped nose and so on. And he had this little entourage of young, generally speaking, young men who would follow him around, and he would go up to people and ask them questions. So he'd be in the Lyceum where people would do business, sometimes engage in sports, sometimes engage in trade, kind of a public arena. And he would hang out, ask questions, talk to people, talk to the politicians and the orators, the artists and the musicians, the poets and so forth, and try to understand what if anything they knew, see what he could learn from them. His student, one of his famous students, was Plato. Plato's dates were approximately 428 BC to 347 BC. He writes, and Plato, especially after the death of Socrates, wrote many of what we now call dialogues, in which he reports, with a certain amount of modification, a certain amount of embellishment, conversations that Socrates had with other Athenians, with various of his students, with other people who were around Greece at that time. Plato then later on founded something known as the Academy, which was founded in about 387 BC, and it was something like Europe's first university. And it closed in AD 529, so it lasted quite a long time. Plato, unlike Socrates, really did espouse theories. He really did have views. He really did believe extremely complex and sophisticated doctrines about the nature of the world and justice and knowledge. And unlike Socrates, took himself to no answers to lots of different questions. And most of what we know about Socrates is from the writings that Plato did that reported conversations that Socrates had with other people. I'm on the grounds, as I was last time, of the University of Virginia, and behind me is an amphitheater where public events happen, usually with students engaged in another kind of song activity, or sometimes we'll have classes out here, sometimes there are pep rallies for upcoming sporting events. But this amphitheater is not a terrible approximation to help us what might have been the case when there were trials that happened in ancient Athens. Trials in ancient Athens are very different from what we know today. Now, Athens was a democracy. People voted and elected their government as best they could, except for those occasions in which tyrants, military dictators of various kinds took over, generally speaking, right after Athens lost a war. But when democracy was restored, jurors would be engaged in trying anybody who's been accused of a crime. But jurors at that time were constituted in a very different way, so that back in ancient Athens, when someone was on trial, anybody who was around on the given day of the trial could present themselves to volunteer to be part of a jury, and that jury was supposed to consist of 501 of one's fellow Athenians. They would be the ones who would decide your fate after hearing the pros and cons of your case. So we enter the action, as it were, with Socrates being on trial, and he has been accused by some fellow Athenians of doing some terrible things. So what are the accusations? Well, they're among these. Some people have said that he makes the worst argument seem the stronger. That means something like he's messing with people's minds. He's making distortions or turnings over of various kinds of fact to make people perhaps be confused. That's one. The other people say he busies himself studying things in the sky and the earth. And the idea is something like he seems to spend his time trying to understand nature as opposed to doing what normal people do, which is something more like engaging in business and trying to make a living. And people say that he also teaches these things that he says he learns about nature to others. So he's been charged with teaching people things, which is, if you think about it, kind of a strange charge. Now, that charge that he's been teaching people things gets transformed into a more specific one later on, as we'll see in a moment, according to which Socrates has been corrupting the youth of Athens. So we'll get back to that charge of his being a corrupting influence on the youth of Athens. Now, Socrates says, when he's put in front of the 501 jurors, that he has been accused of saying that he knows things, that he has this great knowledge of the world, but he says, I would be very proud if I had such knowledge, but as a matter of fact, I don't have any such knowledge. As a matter of fact, I take myself to be pretty ignorant of just about everything. And so this charge against me that I go around professing knowledge is without basis, Socrates says.